Indigenous peoples of the land where we're meeting the honour of being able to conduct our business in their presence and acknowledge their ancestors and spirits. Madam Chair, we certainly agree with the comments you were making about having interactive dialogue with the states, getting more discussion going so we can get transparency and accountability, and we quite welcome that, and in fact it's a discussion that we try to have also with the Government of Australia back home about when we go to these international forums that we have some clarity. We don't have to agree, but we should certainly have some clarity about what we say, but unfortunately we're still, I think, giving different messages which would probably leave people confused. So in my statement, I just want to give a brief account of the contemporary situation in Australia regarding the rights of our First Peoples. Our right to self-determination, particularly to determine our political status, to exercise self-government or other forms of autonomy, to freely pursue our economic, social and cultural development, is still not acknowledged by the state, and in fact is prevented through specific policies and actions taken unilaterally by the state without decision-making from our peoples. It's disappointing to say, for example, that the 50 or so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander governments that formerly existed in Australia before the adoption of the Declaration no longer exist since the Declaration. All formal Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander governments have since 2007 either been abolished or are otherwise mainstreamed so that they no longer reflect representation by our people or decision-making by our people. They in fact have no reference to Indigenous in their structures at all. Now, in these few words, I point out that the rights contained in Articles 3, 4, 5 and 6 of the Declaration remain absolutely ignored by the state since the state voted against the Declaration back in 2007. This situation of our collective failure to make progress on the rights of Indigenous peoples in Australia is most likely typical of scenarios around the world in most countries where Indigenous peoples are trying to get self-determination. At the national and international level, the states have not made sufficient effort to acknowledge our rights to self-determination, to self-government or political development. Now, Madam Chair, I'd like to turn my attention to the study on the optional protocol to the Declaration, and having a read of that study, we have a few comments. It follows the expectations of the states and Indigenous peoples who worked to achieve so hard to get that Declaration together and adopted, that following the adoption of the Declaration, partnerships between states and Indigenous peoples would be formed, would be developed to ensure that the minimum rights set out in the Declaration can be achieved through partnerships, through cooperative efforts and in good faith. But they are not being met, and unfortunately I think in many places not even being attempted. In most regions of the world, in fact every region except Asia Pacific, there does exist regional courts where Indigenous peoples could address their disputes with their states. However, these courts, although not controlled by the states, do not necessarily meet the standard set out in Article 27 of the Declaration, that is, that they are fair, independent, impartial, open and transparent processes to adjudicate the rights of Indigenous peoples. It is for this reason that we remain interested in exploring the idea of an optional protocol as outlined in that document, E/C19/2014/7. We realise, of course, it would be a challenge within the UN system to have states agree to comply with standards of accountability and transparency. But we should be reminded that the General Assembly has already concluded that Indigenous peoples of the world have, and I quote, suffered from historical injustices as a result of, inter alia, their colonisation and dispossession of their lands, territories and resources, thus preventing them from exercising their right to development in accordance with their own needs and interests. And we say we've achieved that base back in 2007. Why aren't we progressing beyond it? It is from this base, this realisation, that the United Nations must provide member states with the opportunity to reform their long-term and institutionalised treatment of Indigenous peoples. They must change their ways. Madam Chair, the astounding achievement of the Declaration was not to define human rights. That has been determined for a long time through the Universal Bill of Rights, but to identify the collective rights that have been historically denied to the Indigenous peoples. That is, the rights to our lands, our territories, our resources, and the rights to our institutions and our systems. We therefore see merit and relevance in the recommendation in that document to establish an optional protocol, a voluntary mechanism at the international level to which Indigenous peoples, along with states, can direct claims and disputes in relation to lands, territories and resources. We support fully the recommendations in para 48 of that report, but would like to add that in order to ensure fair and independent arbitration, the mechanism should have the capacity to identify and communicate directly with Indigenous peoples' governments, representative institutions or authorities. Finally, Madam Chair, we suggest that the Permanent Forum consider obtaining from ECOSOC a decision for a further study to be conducted on this subject, which will address relevant issues raised during our session. And I emphasise there that we would like to see the Economic and Social Council supporting these sorts of studies and commitment from the states. Thank you, Madam Chair.